like to think that the greats of each sport, no matter what era they played in, that they could play in any era as long as they adapt and train accordingly. And with the Michael Jordan Last Dance documentary going on right now, a lot of people are talking about whether or not LeBron could play in the 80s and 90s, with how physical it was and how the rules were different back then. There's a tweet that I saw that asked the question on who would win between the bad boy Pistons and today's Lakers team with LeBron and AD. And see, the problem with this to me is that it didn't specify like what rules are they playing by, because if they're playing by the 80s rules, then you're pretty much gonna be beating and hitting people when they come into the lane. Or if you're playing by today's rules, then the entire Piston team would foul out probably by halftime. And you know, of course, this involved Jordan and LeBron fans fighting back and forth between who's better and why. But LeBron is by far the most criticized athlete to ever play his sport ever. I mean, he's definitely the most criticized basketball player. At this point, he's the most criticized athlete to ever play the game. When the question came up on whether or not LeBron could play back then in the 80s and 90s, some people said that he's just too soft, he would flop, he doesn't have the mindset, the killer mindset to play back then. And others took the side as though he's 6'9", 250. He's bigger, stronger, faster, more athletic than pretty much just about everyone else, except probably about Jordan. I always kind of sort of find these debates interesting because let's say we take Jordan from the 90s and put him in today's league where you're going to get fouled more, you can't be as physical as you was back then, and then they're more three-point shooting league, you're going to have more spacing, you're going to have centers, big men that can shoot, and they won't be clogging up the lane, which means more spacing for a guy like Jordan, which means he'll be able to finish at the lane more. It just seems that when you talk about like who could play in what era, that you could bring a player from the 80s and 90s and people will say that they would play better in today's league, but if we bring someone from today's league and put them back in the 80s and 90s, that they wouldn't be able to survive. And you know, I always kind of sort of find that interesting, especially with like LeBron. So when it comes to the question on whether or not LeBron could play back then in the 80s and 90s, I mean, you got to remember, LeBron used to play football. He played tight end. He was Mr. Football in Ohio. So I'm pretty sure that he's used to getting hit. Even with all the flopping and the apparent crybabiness that people say he is, I definitely think that LeBron could play and be great in the 80s and 90s, without a doubt.